What is the price of a single dance? For Anneliese Vance, it was her reputation, her future, and the last shred of her dignity. In a world of glittering chandeliers and whispered lies, she was a ghost, a nobody whose only crime was poverty. The laughter of the aristocracy was a physical blow, each cruel titter a stone cast at her fragile heart. She was about to break to flee into the night and never return. But then a silence fell. A silence colder than winter, commanded by one man. He was the one they all feared, the one they called the Winter Duke, and he was walking straight toward her. The grand ballroom of Lancaster House was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of silk diamonds and calculated smiles. For Anneliese Vance, it felt less like a galaxy and more like a predator's den, and she, the trembling field mouse, caught in the open. Every rustle of her gown, a simple muslin of pale blue made by her own hands, sounded like a thunderclap against the confident swish of Venetian silks and French brocades worn by the other young ladies. Her mother had insisted this was their chance. A single well-placed invitation procured through a distant cousin with more pity than affection was meant to be a lifeline. For Anneliese, it felt like a noose. She stood near a marble column, trying to merge with its cold, indifferent stone. Her gloved hands were clammy, clutching a small, worn dance card, as if it were a holy relic that could ward off the beasts of this gilded jungle. Her father, a good man with a mind for books, but not for business, had lost everything in a disastrous shipping venture a few years prior. Their name, once respectable, was now whispered with a mixture of pity and disdain. They were the Vances, the family who had fallen. Did you see her gown? A voice sharp and saccharine sliced through the orchestral melody. Lady Beatrice Finch, a diamond of the first water with a heart of flint, glided past her friends, fluttering in her wake like venomous butterflies. I believe my scullery maid wore something similar last spring. To scrub the floors, of course. A wave of cruel, suppressed giggles followed. Anneliese's cheeks burned with a fire that felt hot enough to melt the very marble she leaned against. She stared fixedly at a tapestry depicting a triumphant hunting scene, praying for the floor to swallow her whole. The hunters in the tapestry seemed kinder than the predators in this room. Her eyes darted across the floor, a kaleidoscope of motion and color. She saw men of influence, their chests puffed with self-importance, and women whose smiles were weapons. And then she saw him. In a quiet alcove, away from the throng, stood Duke Alistair Beaumont. He was known as the Winter Duke, and the moniker was apt. He was tall and impeccably dressed, in severe black, a stark slash of midnight in a room of peacocks. His face was a masterpiece of aristocratic planes and angles, but his expression was one of profound, chilling indifference. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept over the room with a look of such utter boredom, it bordered on contempt. Legends surrounded him. They said his heart had been broken years ago by a faithless fiancée, and the pieces had frozen over, leaving him incapable of warmth or joy. He rarely attended such events, and when he did, he never danced. He simply watched a silent, powerful judge presiding over a court of fools. His presence was a paradox. The most eligible bachelor in all of England was also the most unapproachable. Anneliese's brief moment of observation was shattered by a new tormentor, Lord Harrington, a man whose powdered wig seemed to contain more sense than his head, approached her with a foppish grin. He was Beatrice's closest confidant and shared her cruel disposition. "Miss Vance, is it not?" He drawled, his eyes performing a slow, insulting appraisal of her attire, lingering in the shadows. A wise choice. The light can be so unforgiving Annalise forced a tight, polite smile. "Lord Harrington." I was simply admiring the architecture. The architecture, he boomed with false bonhomie, drawing the attention of those nearby. "My dear girl, one does not come to the Lancaster Ball to admire the cornices. One comes to be admired, or at the very least to be noticed." His gaze flicked pointedly to her dress again. Beatrice drifted back, her smile predatory. "Perhaps Miss Vance is a scholar of some sort." "Tell us, Miss Vance, what do you study?" "The art of wallflowering." The circle around them widened. The music seemed to fade, replaced by a low hum of anticipation. This was sport to them. Annalise felt her throat tighten, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, sharp and dissecting. She was a specimen under their microscope. I enjoy reading," she stammered, hating the weakness in her voice. Reading Harrington clapped his hands together. "How quaint. My horse reads the racing forms, but I don't bring him into society." The laughter that followed was no longer suppressed. It was open, sharp, and echoing. It crashed over Annalise in a suffocating wave. It filled her ears, her head, her soul. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. She saw their faces a gallery of smirking, contemptuous masks. Beatrice's triumphant sneer, Harrington's smug, cruel eyes, the curious, detached amusement of the onlookers. This was a new level of hell, a public flaying of her spirit. She trembled beneath the onslaught, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. This was it. This was the moment she would break. She would turn and run, and the sound of their laughter would chase her all the way back to the quiet, respectable obscurity from which she had so foolishly emerged. Annalise's world had shrunk to the mocking eyes and laughing mouths that surrounded her. The grand ballroom, with its soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers, felt like it was closing in the ornate walls, pressing down on her. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Humiliation was a physical entity, a hot, acrid thing, coiling in her stomach and threatening to choke her. She took a half-step back, her heel catching on the hem of her simple gown. The instinct to flee was overwhelming, a primal scream in her mind, urging her to run to escape the echo of their scorn. And then silence. It did not creep in. It fell like a guillotine. One moment the air was thick with derision. The next it was utterly still, save for the distant, oblivious strains of the orchestra. The laughter died in the throats of the jesters. Smirks froze and faded from faces. Beatrice Finch's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by one of stunned confusion. Every head in their vicinity turned in a single unified direction. Through the parting crowd, he moved with a grace that was both fluid and formidable. Duke Alastair Beaumont, the Winter Duke, was walking toward them. He did not hurry, yet his progress was inexorable, a force of nature that the frivolous sea of society instinctively made way for. His stormy grey eyes were not fixed on the crowd, nor on the preening Lord Harrington, or the suddenly pale Lady Beatrice. They were fixed with an unnerving, unreadable intensity on Annalise. She froze, her panic momentarily eclipsed by sheer shock. The Duke never involved himself. He was a statue, a monument to aloofness. For him to move to act was as unthinkable as the sun rising in the west. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the silver threads in his dark waistcoat and the faint, almost invisible scar that traced a line near his temple. He was even taller up close, a formidable presence that blocked out the rest of the room. The air around him seemed degrees cooler. He paid no heed to Harrington, who stood gaping like a landed fish, or to Beatrice, who was hastily trying to compose her features into a welcoming smile. Alistair's gaze remained on Annalise, his expression as impassive as ever, yet his eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't name. It was not pity. It was something sharper, more focused. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and clear, cutting through the residual tension in the air. It held no warmth, but it was steady and absolute, a rock in the swirling tide of her distress. She could only manage a nod, her throat too tight for words. He extended a gloved hand. It was a gesture of stark, undeniable command. "You have not yet danced this evening." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Annalise stared at his hand as if it were a phantom limb. The room held its collective breath. The Duke, the Winter Duke, did not dance. To offer his hand to anyone was a cataclysmic social event. To offer it to a mocked, penniless nobody from the country. It was madness. It was a declaration. Lord Harrington finally found his voice, a sycophantic, sputtering sound. "Your Grace." "We were just entertaining Miss Vance, a bit of light-hearted banter." Alistair's eyes shifted to Harrington for a fraction of a second. The coldness in his gaze was so profound, so utterly dismissive, that Harrington physically flinched, his words dying on his lips. Without another glance at him or Beatrice, the Duke returned his attention to Annalise. His hand remained suspended in the air between them. "The orchestra is playing a waltz," he stated simply. "I find myself in need of a partner." Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. To refuse would be an insult of unimaginable proportions. To accept would be to step into a spotlight so bright it would surely burn her to ash. But as she looked from the Duke's waiting hand to the stunned, furious face of Beatrice Finch, she felt a tiny defiant spark ignite in the depths of her soul. He was offering her a shield, a strange, cold, and terrifying shield, but a shield nonetheless. Slowly, as if moving through water, she raised her own trembling hand and placed it in his. His grip was firm, secure, and surprisingly warm through the layers of their gloves. The contact sent a jolt through her, a grounding current in her sea of anxiety. Without another word, he turned and led her toward the dance floor. The crowd parted for them as if Moses were commanding the Red Sea. Whispers erupted in their wake, a shocked, frantic buzzing that was entirely different from the earlier laughter. It was a sound of disbelief, of speculation, of awe. As they reached the center of the floor, Alistair turned to face her, placing one hand on her waist and taking her other in his. The orchestra swelled, and he guided her into the graceful, sweeping steps of the waltz. Annalise was a competent dancer. It was one of the few genteel accomplishments her mother had insisted upon. But in the Duke's arms, she felt clumsy, unreal. She kept her eyes downcast, focused on the polished toes of his black boots, too afraid to meet his gaze or look at the hundreds of eyes she knew were now watching their every move. "Look up, Miss Vance," he commanded quietly, his voice for her ears alone. She obeyed, forcing her gaze upward. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control. Yet his eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not contempt, but an intense analytical curiosity. "Why were they laughing at you?" he asked, his tone devoid of emotion. It was a simple request for data. "My gown, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It is not of the latest fashion. Fashion is the concern of those with nothing else to think about," he replied dismissively. He guided her through a complex turn with effortless precision. For a man who supposedly never danced, he moved with a lethal, practiced grace. They are fools. Insipid, weak-minded fools. Their opinions are worth less than the dust on my boots. The finality of his statement was strangely comforting. He wasn't offering platitudes or sympathy. He was delivering a verdict, and in his court, her tormentors had already been judged and found wanting. As they danced, his gaze dropped for a moment to her throat. A simple silver locket was nestled there, her most treasured possession. It had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. It was old, tarnished, and of little monetary value, but it was her one connection to a past unmarred by poverty and shame. She saw his eyes narrow almost imperceptibly as he looked at it, a flicker of something recognition-confusion, before his gaze returned to hers, his expression, once again, a perfect, impenetrable mask. The music drew to a close. They stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the sole focus of the entire ballroom. The silence was deafening. Then, as was custom, he bowed. It was a perfect formal gesture. Anneliese curtsied in return, her movements stiff with nerves. He did not immediately release her hand. Instead of leading her back to the shadows of her column, he kept her at his side. He turned his cool gaze upon the assembly, and in a voice that carried across the silent room, made a proclamation that would shatter the social landscape of the season. Miss Vance has honored me with this dance. She will remain with me for the rest of the evening. It was not an invitation or a request. It was a decree. The Winter Duke had not just saved her. He had claimed her, and no one in that room could fathom why. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze for Anneliese. To be at the Duke of Beaumont's side was to exist within a bubble of untouchable power. Those who had mocked her now offered tremulous smiles and hasty curtsies. Lord Harrington seemed to have vanished entirely, while Lady Beatrice watched from afar, her face a thunderous mask of fury and disbelief. Anneliese was offered lemonade by footmen who bowed so low their heads nearly touched the floor. She was introduced to earls and viscounts, who moments before would not have deigned to notice her existence. They all treated her with a terrified deference, their eyes darting from her to the Duke, trying to solve the impossible puzzle she presented. Alistair himself was a study in controlled stillness. He said little, yet his presence was a constant, formidable weight beside her. He procured a seat for her in a small, slightly more private alcove, and stood guard like a sentinel. He did not engage in pleasantries, offering only curt nods to acquaintances, and deflecting any attempts at prolonged conversation with a single chilling glance. For Anneliese, the protection was both a blessing and a torment. She was safe from the vipers, but she was now trapped in a gilded cage with a lion. She was acutely aware of his gaze, which would often rest on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was not a romantic gaze. It was speculative intense, as if he were trying to deconstruct a complex clockwork mechanism. More than once, she saw his eyes drift down to the simple silver locket at her throat. "Your necklace," he said abruptly, his voice startling her out of a nervous reverie. "It is an unusual design." Anneliese's hand flew to the locket, her fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal. "It was my mother's, Your Grace. It has been in my family for generations." "I see," was all he said, but his eyes lingered on it for a moment longer, a storm of unreadable thoughts brewing in their grey depths. When the time came to depart, the Duke personally escorted her to the crush of carriages outside. He did not speak, but simply walked her through the throngs of departing guests who parted before him like water. He found her family's hired carriage, a modest, slightly battered vehicle that looked utterly pathetic next to the gleaming, lacquered coaches of the aristocracy, and handed her in himself. "Miss Vance," he said, standing at the carriage door. The gaslight cast his chiseled features in sharp relief. I trust you will be attending the Duchess of Pemberley's garden party on Saturday." Again, it was not a question. It was an expectation. Anneliese, whose family had not received, nor ever expected to receive such a prestigious invitation, could only stare at him bewildered. "We do not have an invitation, Your Grace," she stammered. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "You do now. It will be delivered tomorrow morning." He gave a short, decisive nod. "Good evening." And with that, he closed the door and was gone, melting back into the shadows of the London night, leaving Anneliese utterly breathless and confused. The next morning, as promised, a footman in the Beaumont livery delivered a thick, cream-coloured envelope. Inside was not only an invitation to the Duchess of Pemberley's exclusive event, but also a note from a prestigious London modiste, Madame Dubois, stating that the Duke had arranged a line of credit for Miss Vance to acquire a new wardrobe, and that she was expected for a fitting at her earliest convenience. Her mother, Mrs. Vance, was beside herself with a mixture of elation and terror. "Anneliese the Duke, what can this possibly mean? A wardrobe, a garden party?" It is beyond all comprehension. Anneliese felt the same. The Duke's actions were inexplicable. It could not be a courtship. He was the Winter Duke, a man who had forsworn all romantic entanglement. It could not be charity. He was not known for his philanthropic impulses. It was a maneuver, a strategic play in a game whose rules she didn't understand, and she was the pawn. Meanwhile, in his stone-faced mansion on Belgrave Square, Alistair Beaumont stood before a crackling fire in his library, despite the mildness of the day. The room was his sanctuary, filled with books, maps, and silence. In his hand he held a small, exquisitely painted miniature portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair. It was his mother, the late Duchess, who had died when he was just a boy. Around her neck in the portrait was a silver locket, intricately carved with the image of a climbing rose. It was identical to the one Anneliese Vance wore. He had commissioned his man of affairs, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man named Mr. Graves, to begin an inquiry the moment he had returned home from the ball. The Vances' Graves had reported that afternoon, standing stiffly before the Duke's massive mahogany desk. A respectable family, Your Grace. Merchant class, but well regarded. The father, Thomas Vance, was ruined 3 years ago. A partnership in a shipping company, the Orion Trading Concern, went bankrupt. Lost everything. They say the partner, a Sir Reginald Finch, absconded with the remaining capital. Alistair's eyes narrowed. Finch. Any relation to Lady Beatrice? Finch, her uncle, Your Grace, though he passed away a year ago. Died of a fever in the West Indies, leaving significant debts. The connection was tenuous, but it was there. A web of intrigue was beginning to form, and at its center was the quiet girl with the familiar locket. His initial impulse at the ball had been one of pure, unadulterated disgust at the behavior of his peers. Their petty cruelty was a reflection of the same shallow society that had celebrated his former fiancée, only to whisper behind their hands when she had betrayed him with his own cousin. Seeing Anneliese so clearly out of her depth, and yet possessing a quiet dignity, had stirred something in him, a protective instinct he had thought long dead. But the locket, that was different. That was personal. His mother had cherished that piece of jewelry. She had told him it was a gift from a dear childhood friend, a girl from a lesser but beloved family, a friend she had lost contact with after her marriage into the aristocracy. The locket had been lost, supposedly stolen, shortly before her death. Alistair had never forgotten it. Find out everything you can about Thomas Vance's business dealings, Alistair commanded Graves. I want to see the ledgers for the Orion Trading Concern. I want to know where every last shilling went, and find out where Mrs. Vance, the former Miss Eleanor Croft, grew up. I want to know the names of her childhood friends. Graves bowed. It will be done, Your Grace. Alistair turned back to the fire, the miniature of his mother cool in his hand. He had stepped onto the board, making a move that had sent shockwaves through the ton. They all thought it was a whim, an inexplicable fancy of a cold-bored duke. They were wrong. This was not a game of hearts. It was a hunt, and Annalise Vance, whether she knew it or not, held the map. The Duchess of Pemberley's garden party was a masterpiece of curated nature. Perfectly manicured lawns sloped down to an ornamental lake where swans glided with practiced elegance. Ladies in pastel silks strolled beneath the shade of ancient oaks, their laughter like the tinkling of wind chimes. For Annalise it was another battlefield, but this time she was armed. Dressed in a gown of primrose yellow, a creation of Madame Dubois, that felt like wearing solidified sunshine, she no longer looked like a country mouse. The cut was simple, yet elegant, the fabric exquisite. A matching bonnet framed her face, giving her an air of quiet confidence she did not feel. But the armor helped. When she arrived, she was no longer met with sneers, but with looks of intense, burning curiosity. The whispers followed her, but their tone had changed from mockery to speculation. She saw Lady Beatrice holding court near a rose trellis, her face tightening with fury when she saw Annalise. Their eyes met across the lawn, and Beatrice gave a small, venomous smile that promised retribution. Annalise's stomach fluttered with nerves, but before her anxiety could take hold, a familiar, calm voice spoke from behind her. "Yellow suits you, Miss Vance." She turned to find Duke Alistair Beaumont standing there. He was dressed less severely than at the ball in a tailored grey coat and light-coloured trousers, but his formidable presence was undiminished. He looked almost out of place among the vibrant flowers and cheerful chatter, a panther resting in a field of daisies. "Your Grace." She curtsied her heart, giving a strange leap. "Thank you for the dress. It is more than I could have ever dreamed." "Nonsense. It is merely fabric and thread. It is the woman who gives it merit." He said the compliment so direct and devoid of flirtation that it sounded like a simple observation of fact. He gestured toward a more secluded path that wound through a grove of birch trees. "Walk with me." It was once again a command. As they strolled away from the main gathering, the noise of the party faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel underfoot and the gentle rustle of leaves. For the first time, Annalise felt she could breathe. "I must confess, Your Grace, I do not understand your intentions," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She had to know. The uncertainty was eating her alive. Alistair stopped by a stone bench overlooking the lake and turned to face her. His grey eyes were serious, searching. "My intentions are for the moment my own. Let us just say, I have an abiding distaste for bullies and an interest in puzzles." "Am I a puzzle, Your Grace? You are," he confirmed without hesitation. His gaze dropped to her locket, which she wore as always. "That locket. You said it has been in your family for generations. Tell me its story." Annalise sat on the bench, her fingers tracing the familiar rose pattern. "My mother Eleanor received it from her mother, and my grandmother received it from a childhood friend, a promise of eternal friendship. Her friend was a young lady of much higher station. They grew up on neighbouring estates in the countryside, but the girl was married off to a powerful nobleman, and they lost touch. My grandmother always spoke of her with great affection." Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And what was this friend's name?" Lady Annabel Annalise replied. "Just Annabel," my grandmother would say. She never spoke her family name. It was not proper. Alistair's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Annabel had been his mother's name. It was all falling into place. His mother's lost friend was Annalise's grandmother. The two lockets were not just similar. They were a matching pair, a testament to a childhood bond broken by the rigid class structures they were forced into. This connection explained his mother's fondness for the piece, and its disappearance now seemed far more sinister. "Your father's financial ruin," he said, changing the subject so abruptly it almost gave her whiplash. The Orion trading concern. He was partners with Sir Reginald Finch. Annalise looked up, surprised by his knowledge. "Yes. My father trusted him completely. Sir Reginald handled all the accounts. He told my father the markets had turned, that their investments had failed. He showed him ledgers filled with losses. My father, being a scholar, not a businessman, believed him. By the time the final collapse came, Sir Reginald had already sailed for the Caribbean, and every penny was gone. My father was left with nothing but crippling debt and a broken reputation. He never suspected foul play," Alistair asked, his voice sharp. "He is a man who believes in the goodness of others. Your Grace," Annalise said softly, a note of sad defensiveness in her tone. He could not fathom such a deep betrayal. It destroyed his spirit more than the loss of the money. A belief in the goodness of others is a luxury few can afford. Alistair stated, his voice laced with a cynicism so profound it was chilling. He looked out over the placid lake, but his eyes saw something else, entirely a past filled with his own betrayals. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Annalise found herself studying him, not as the fearsome Winter Duke, but as a man. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the deep-seated weariness in his eyes. He was not just cold, he was wounded. He too was an outsider in his own way, isolated by his rank and his pain, just as she was by her poverty. A fragile, unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them. They were two solitary souls on opposite ends of the social spectrum, both trapped by circumstance. "Your Grace," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I do not know why you are helping me. But I am not a fool. I know that a duke's patronage comes with a price. I have no dowry, no connections, nothing to offer you." He turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time the ice in his eyes seemed to thaw just a little. "You are wrong, Miss Vance. You have something far rarer than a dowry. You have integrity. And you may be the key to righting a very old wrong." Before she could ask what he meant, the sounds of approaching footsteps and shrill laughter broke their solitude. Lady Beatrice and two of her friends appeared at the end of the path. "Well, well," Beatrice purred, her eyes glittering with malice as she took in the sight of them sitting together. Hiding away in the bushes, Duke, and with such unexpected company. One might think you have developed a taste for charity cases. Annalise stiffened, the familiar sting of shame returning. But before she could react, Alistair rose to his full height, his shadow falling over Beatrice like a thundercloud. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "I have developed a taste for polite conversation. A delicacy I see you have no interest in acquiring. If you will excuse us, Miss Vance and I were discussing matters of substance. I suggest you return to your discussion of bonnets and gossip before you find yourself out of your depth." The dismissal was so absolute, so withering, that Beatrice's face turned a mottled shade of red. She opened her mouth to retort, but no sound came out. With a strangled gasp of fury, she turned on her heel and stormed away, her friends scrambling after her. Alistair watched her go, his expression one of pure contempt. Then he looked down at Annalise and offered his arm. "I believe we have had enough of nature for one day," he said. Allow me to escort you back to the battlefield." As she took his arm, the alliance between them felt a little less fragile, a little more real. She was still a pawn in his game, but she was beginning to suspect they were playing against the same opponent. The days that followed the garden party cemented Annalise's new bewildering status in society. Under the unyielding shield of the Duke's patronage, she was no longer an object of scorn, but of intense fascination. Invitations arrived daily. Mothers with eligible sons pushed them forward for introductions, their smiles stretched thin with a mixture of hope and fear. Annalise navigated this new world with a quiet grace that impressed some and infuriated others, particularly Beatrice Finch. Throughout it all, Alistair remained an enigmatic and constant presence. He would appear at her side, at balls, stand with her for long periods at musical evenings, and escort her through the park for afternoon walks. Their conversations remained guarded, circling the edges of the truth he was pursuing, but a strange intimacy grew between them in their shared silences. Annalise found herself noticing the small things, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, the rare, dry wit that would surface unexpectedly, the protective way he would position himself between her and any potential threat. She was beginning to see the man behind the fearsome title, and her feelings were evolving from gratitude into something far more complicated and dangerous. Meanwhile, Alistair's investigation was proceeding at a relentless pace. His man, Mr. Graves, was a phantom, a whisper in the financial district, using the Duke's immense influence to open doors that had been sealed for years. He unearthed clerks who had been dismissed, found porters who remembered late-night shipments of documents, and followed a trail of money that was as convoluted as a serpent's nest. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Graves arrived at the Duke's library, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by a quiet excitement. He laid a heavy dust-covered ledger on the Duke's desk. "From a retired clerk of the Orion trading concern, Your Grace Graves explained. He was dismissed by Sir Reginald Finch shortly before the collapse. He suspected foul play and kept a private copy of the accounts for his own protection." Alistair opened the book. The pages were a sea of numbers and spidery script. For hours he and Graves sat in silence, poring over the entries. The official ledgers, the ones Sir Reginald had shown to Thomas Vance, told a story of failed investments and catastrophic losses. But this secret ledger told a different story entirely. It was a meticulous record of deception. Sir Reginald had created a series of phantom companies. He had used the Orion concern's capital to make profitable investments, recorded them as losses in the official books, and funneled the real profits into his own accounts through these shell corporations. He had systematically bled the company dry, all while showing Annalise's father a tapestry of lies. He didn't just bankrupt Mr. Vance, Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He stole his entire fortune, every last shilling. "There is more," Your Grace Graves said, pointing to a series of entries near the end. Large payments were made from Sir Reginald's private accounts to another party. The payments are coded, but the dates are significant. Alistair leaned closer, his grey eyes scanning the page with laser focus. The name written beside the coded entries was one he recognized with a jolt of ice-cold fury. Harrington. Not Lord Harrington the fop from the ballroom, but his father, the previous Baron Harrington. The Baron was a notorious gambler. Alistair mused, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening speed. Always in debt. Always looking for a new source of income. It appears Sir Reginald Finch was not acting alone, Graves stated. The Baron Harrington likely provided the social cover and the introductions to certain investors in exchange for a substantial share of the stolen profits. They ruined Mr. Vance together. A brutal, elegant conspiracy. Finch, the cunning fraudster, and Harrington Sr., the corrupt aristocrat, had destroyed an honest man and his family for their own greed. And their children, Lord Harrington and Lady Beatrice Finch's niece, were now the darlings of the ton, parading their inherited stolen wealth in the faces of the very people their families had victimized. The rage that filled Alistair was a cold, pure thing. This was not just about Annalise anymore. This was about the rot at the heart of his own class, the hypocrisy and corruption he had despised for so long. He had seen it in his ex-fiancée, who had tried to secure her own family's finances by trapping him. He saw it now in the Finches and the Harringtons. They were vultures in fine clothing. His thoughts turned to the locket. The theft of the locket from his mother's jewelry box now seemed less like a random act of a servant, and more like a deliberate, malicious act. Could Finch have arranged it as a final insult, a way to sever the last tie between the two families he was tearing apart? It was possible. The cruelty was certainly in his character. Graves Alistair said, his voice deceptively calm. "I want you to find definitive proof linking the current Lord Harrington to this wealth. Bank statements, property deeds, anything that shows his current lifestyle is funded by this stolen money. And I want you to find out everything you can about Lady Beatrice's inheritance from her uncle. And then, Your Grace." Alistair closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. A dangerous light gleamed in his eyes. "And then we will set a trap of our own. The Harringtons and the Finches are fond of public sport. It is time they learned what it feels like to be the prey." He knew exactly where he would spring this trap. The social event of the season was less than a fortnight away, the annual Blackwood Masquerade Ball. It was a place of masks and secrets, the perfect stage for the truth to be revealed. He would use their own arrogance, their own love of drama against them. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked London street. His feelings for Annalise had become a tangled knot he could no longer ignore. What had started as a duty to his mother's memory and a desire for justice had become something intensely personal. He admired her resilience, her quiet strength, her unwavering integrity in the face of cruelty. She was a light in the suffocating darkness of his world, and the thought of what had been stolen from her family filled him with a protective fury he had not felt for anyone in a decade. He would not just restore her family's name, he would obliterate those who had wronged her. The Winter Duke was going to war. The news that Duke Alistair Beaumont would be attending the Blackwood Masquerade and that his guest would be Miss Annalise Vance spread through the ton like wildfire. It was the ultimate confirmation of his favor, and it sent Beatrice Finch into a spiral of incandescent rage. In the dimly lit drawing room of her family's townhouse, she paced like a caged tigress. Lord Harrington lounged in a velvet armchair, sipping on a glass of brandy and looking thoroughly bored. "He flaunts her in our faces," Beatrice hissed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That little country mouse, dressed in silks, paid for by him. He makes a mockery of us all. Of me. It is a peculiar fascination, I'll grant you," that Harrington drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But what is to be done? Beaumont is untouchable. To challenge him is social suicide." "I do not intend to challenge him," Beatrice said, a cunning, vicious light entering her eyes. She stopped her pacing and turned to face Harrington. "I intend to destroy her, in a way that even a duke cannot fix." Harrington raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And how do you propose to do that?" He has elevated her. "She is his pet project. Every project has a weakness," Beatrice retorted. "Her weakness is her past, her poverty, her family's utter disgrace. The ton may be fascinated by her now, but they are fickle. They love nothing more than to build up an idol, just to watch it shatter." We will give them a spectacle they will never forget. Her plan was as simple as it was cruel. Using her network of gossips and informants, she had delved deeper into the Vance family's financial ruin. While she did not know the truth of her uncle's and Harrington's father's treachery, she knew the public version that Thomas Vance was a failed merchant drowning in debt. She had paid one of his desperate creditors a handsome sum to provide her with copies of his debt notices. The Blackwood masquerade, she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Everyone will be there. At the stroke of midnight, when the masks are removed, you, my dear Harrington, will make an announcement. A toast. A toast. A toast to the season's most unlikely star, she purred. You will speak of her charm, her beauty, and her incredible cunning. You will paint her as a masterful fortune hunter, a siren who has ensnared the great Duke of Beaumont with a carefully crafted tale of woe. And then, as your grand finale, you will produce these. She tapped a small embroidered satchel on the table, proof of her family's debts. You will read them aloud. You will announce that she is nothing but a beggar in a borrowed gown, preying on the Duke's good nature to save her family from debtor's prison. Harrington's bored expression slowly transformed into a grin of wicked appreciation. Publicly brand her a liar and a grifter. The humiliation will be absolute. Even Beaumont's protection cannot shield her from that. He will be forced to drop her, lest he look like a fool who was duped by a pretty face. Exactly, Beatrice confirmed, her smile triumphant. He may be a duke, but he cannot command respect. He will be a laughingstock. And she will be ruined. Utterly and irrevocably. She will never be able to show her face in London again. Their plot was set. They were blinded by their own arrogance, confident in their social standing, and the version of history their fathers had so carefully constructed. They saw Annalise as a weak, easy target, and the Duke as a cold, emotionless man who would discard her the moment she became an embarrassment. They had no idea that they were not the hunters, but the prey walking willingly into a perfectly constructed snare. On the evening of the masquerade, Annalise stood before the mirror in her bedchamber, her heart aflutter with a mix of excitement and dread. Alistair had sent over a costume for her. It was a gown of the deepest midnight blue, embroidered with silver stars that glittered as if they had been plucked from the night sky. The mask that accompanied it was a delicate creation of silver filigree shaped like a crescent moon and studded with tiny sapphires. She was Selene, the goddess of the moon. When Alistair arrived to collect her, he was dressed in a costume of severe, elegant black, accented with silver. His mask was a simple, unadorned black domino that did little to hide the intensity of his grey eyes. He was Erebus, the god of shadow and darkness, the moon and the shadow. He stopped in the doorway of her family's modest drawing room, his gaze sweeping over her. For a moment, he was utterly still. "You are," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, luminous. A blush rose on her cheeks. "And you, your grace, are the night itself." "Tonight," he said, offering his arm, his expression becoming serious no matter what happens, "you must trust me. Do you understand?" His gravity sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. "I do," she whispered, placing her hand on his arm. As they rode to the ball, she could feel the tension radiating from him. This was not just another social event. This was a reckoning. The final pieces of his plan were in place. Mr. Graves had delivered his final report that morning, incontrovertible evidence that Harrington's entire estate and Beatrice's generous inheritance were built upon the foundations of the money stolen from Thomas Vance. Alistair held their ruin in his hands, and tonight he intended to close his fist. He was bringing the cold, unforgiving justice of winter to the glittering facade of the London season. The ballroom at Blackwood Manor was a dazzling fantasy. Lit by 1,000 candles, the vast chamber was filled with masked figures in elaborate costumes, gods and goddesses, kings and jesters, mythical creatures and historical figures. The air hummed with intrigue and champagne-fueled laughter. Annalise, as Selene, clung to the arm of Erebus, her shadow and her shield. His presence was a silent warning, and they moved through the throng untouched, observed from a distance, but unapproached. She saw them across the room, a peacock in garish gold and a serpent in glittering green. Lord Harrington and Lady Beatrice. They watched her with triumphant predatory smiles, utterly confident in the trap they were about to spring. Annalise felt a tremor of fear, but Alistair's hand gently squeezed her arm in a gesture of reassurance. "Patience," he murmured, his voice, a low rumble beside her ear. The serpent always overestimates its own cunning. As the grand clock in the hall began to chime, the approach of midnight, a hush of anticipation fell over the crowd. It was the tradition of the Blackwood masquerade. At the final stroke of 12, the masks would be removed. Just as the 11th chime faded, Lord Harrington stepped forward, holding up a glass of champagne. "My friends," he called out, his voice ringing with false cheer. "Before the magic of the evening ends, I would like to propose a toast." Alistair guided Annalise to a spot near the centre of the room, positioning them in the full view of the assembly. He stood slightly behind her, a dark, silent guardian. A toast. Harrington continued, his eyes visible above his golden mask, fixing on Annalise to the brightest new star in our firmament. The enchanting Miss Annalise Vance. A smattering of polite applause followed. Annalise's heart began to pound. This was it. The attack. She appeared among us like a phantom. Harrington declared, his voice taking on a theatrical, patronizing tone. So modest, so gentle. She captivated us all, but none more so than our most discerning and formidable Duke of Beaumont. He bowed his head, mockingly, in Alistair's direction. We were all mystified. What was the source of her incredible charm? What secret did she possess to melt the heart of the Winter Duke himself? He paused for dramatic effect, letting the question hang in the air. Beatrice watched from the side, a smug, venomous smile playing on her lips. I have discovered her secret. Harrington announced, his voice booming. It is a story of incredible fortitude. A tale of a young woman so devoted to her family that she would do anything to save them from ruin. Even weave a masterful web of deception. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harrington reached into a satchel and triumphantly pulled out a sheaf of papers. I hold here, my friends, the truth. Notices of debt proof that the Vance family is destitute on the very brink of being thrown into Newgate Prison. This entire performance has been a desperate, cunning ploy to ensnare a wealthy patron. She is not a star. She is a common fortune hunter. He held the papers aloft like a trophy. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of shocked whispers. All eyes turned to Annalise. The humiliation was 1,000 times worse than at the first ball. It was a public branding, a sentence of social death. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she felt the floor sway beneath her. The clock began to strike the 12th and final chime of midnight. Bong! As the sound echoed through the silent room, every guest began to lower their mask. Bong! Harrington stood preening, relishing his victory. Beatrice looked ecstatic. Bong! And then a calm, cold voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. A compelling story, Lord Harrington. But you seem to have omitted several key chapters. Alistair Beaumont stepped forward, removing his mask. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. Harrington and Beatrice stared, their triumph beginning to curdle into confusion. "It is true that Mr. Thomas Vance is a man in debt, Alistair," stated his powerful voice, commanding the attention of every person in the room. "But you have neglected to mention why." He held up a thick, leather-bound ledger. Annalise recognized it from nowhere, but Harrington's face went pale. "I hold in my hand, ladies and gentlemen, the true private accounts of the Orion trading concern," Alistair announced. "A fascinating document. It details a systematic and ruthless fraud perpetrated by two men. The first, a merchant named Sir Reginald Finch." He paused, letting Beatrice's name hang in the air with her uncle's. The second, he continued, his eyes locking onto Harrington, was his partner in crime, your father, the late Baron Harrington. The gasp that swept the room was like a tidal wave. Harrington looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "My father? That is a monstrous lie," he sputtered. "Is it?" Alistair retorted, his voice dripping with contempt. "This ledger details how they siphoned every penny of Mr. Vance's investment into their own pockets, leaving him with a bankrupt company and manufactured debts. It shows precisely how the fortune you currently enjoy, Lord Harrington, and the inheritance you received, Lady Beatrice, was stolen directly from the Vance family." He tossed a second bundle of papers onto a nearby table. "And these are the bank drafts and property deeds to prove it. Your townhouse, Harrington, bought with Mr. Vance's money. Your diamond necklace, Lady Beatrice paid for by the ruin of an honest man. The world had turned upside down. The accusers were now the accused." Beatrice Finch let out a small, strangled cry, her face ashen white. Harrington stood, frozen, his mouth agape, the debt notices fluttering from his numb fingers to the floor. Alistair walked over to Annalise, who was staring at him, her mind reeling in disbelief. He took her hand, his touch both gentle and possessive. He turned back to the stunned, silent crowd. "You see before you not a fortune hunter, but the victim of a grotesque injustice. An injustice I intend to rectify. I will be personally funding a lawsuit on behalf of the Vance family to reclaim every stolen asset. I suspect, Lord Harrington, you will find debtor's prison far less amusing from the inside." He looked at Beatrice, his gaze utterly devoid of mercy. "And you, Lady Beatrice, will soon discover that society is far crueler to a penniless fraud than it is to an impoverished innocent." With that final devastating pronouncement, he turned his back on their shattered enemies. He looked down at Annalise, and for the first time in front of the entire world, a genuine warm smile touched his lips. The winter in his eyes had finally melted. "Annalise Vance," he said, his voice now for her alone. "Your family's name will be restored. Your future is secure. The only question that remains is whether you will consider sharing that future with me." Before them all, under the light of 1,000 candles, the coldest duke in England got down on one knee. He had not just taken her hand, he had offered her his heart, his name, and a lifetime of justice, truth, and love. In the end, it was never about the dress, the title, or the money. It was about the quiet strength that endures when the world is cruel, and the courage to see the truth in someone when everyone else is blinded by lies. Annalise and Alistair's story reminds us that the deepest wounds can be healed, and that even the coldest heart can be thawed by the warmth of a genuine connection. They found in each other not just a partner, but a sanctuary, a place where their true selves were not only seen, but celebrated. Their journey from a crowded ballroom to a shared future proves that true nobility lies not in one's bloodline, but in one's actions, and that the most powerful statement one can make is to take the hand of another and stand with them against the world. if their story of justice and love resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of kindness to triumph over cruelty, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a reminder that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. Thank you for listening.